great pleasure to be here, and thank you to, can you see this behind, and to Rudy and Anna and the WFTO committee to invite me. Who was at the meeting in Kathmandu? Hands up. Okay, so you've got to put up with me again, I'm afraid. So they very sensibly didn't invite me to Mombasa, but after 4 years they thought I could come back and talk to you. And some of the things I'll say today do build on that talk I gave in Kathmandu, some of you might have seen. But I hope also that I have some new things to say. And the challenge I was set was really to reflect on the future of fair trade, which is something I think about a lot. I'm sure the rest of us do too. And I'm an optimist, so I want to tell you, I suppose, a hopeful story today, but one also that is full of challenges as well. Okay. So we got some big questions, and these have been very much raised already in the opening discussion that we were just listening to. But it's a kind of measure of fair trade success, I guess, and we're now having to think about what happens next. What's the meaning of fair trade today, given that the mainstream has embraced it increasingly? You know, do we have to think of fair trade sort of 2.0? I sort of use a bit of computer language as we go on to that. You know, second generation, as we've been saying already, of fair trade. Kind of the early work might have been done. So what's the distinctive role fair trade and all you people doing wonderful work in fair trade can play? And what can WTO do particularly in this new world? So let's have a question. How's fair trade like the iPod? Who owns an iPod? Hands up. Not many of you, okay. Well, it's a stupid question then, really, so I've thrown that already, right? Let's go to coffee. So you could say it's kind of cool. You could say it's popular. You could say, certainly at these meetings, it's quite musical. But I'm going to come back to that. But hold in your head, maybe, what might it be that fair trade has in common with an iPod in a positive way? I encourage those of you who haven't got one to borrow one from somebody, if not buy it. But let's remember also to begin with how extraordinary fair trade is, and I do think we sometimes forget this if we're really buried in the everyday business of fair trade. So we know that, on the one hand, it's got this extraordinary agenda around producer development, the economic agenda. So the model is this, again, extraordinary idea for market-driven ethical consumption. You know, people buying stuff for reasons other than just their own betterment, but within a market economy often. So the focus has been on growing the market. Mainstreaming has been seen as key in this dimension. And for all that you know, Rudy and others have quite rightly pointed out that sales are difficult, and these are figures only from 2009, forgive me for putting a flow chart there. The broad picture has been of a positive growth in sales globally over the past 10 to 15 years, and of course there are regional difficulties, and the economic crisis that I want to say more about in a minute presents real challenges. But broadly speaking, in terms of the mainstreaming and the market growth agenda, has been phenomenal success that most other sectors in retail would die for, incredibly envious of. And we know the mainstreaming agenda has happened, for good or bad. So whether it's Cadbury Kraft, or whether it's Tesco, or whether it's Emma Watson there. Actually, full disclosure, I'm on the board of Peopletree, so I'm going to mention Peopletree a couple of times. Forgive me for that plug. Otherwise, Safir is here kicking me if I didn't mention it, so I have to mention it occasionally. So there's Emma Watson who worked with us in Peopletree, so that's a pretty mainstream, you know, movie star working on building a collection there. But the other side, of course, is the social and trade justice side of Peopletree, but also fair trade. It's an extraordinary combination of a market-driven approach, but also a clear focus, particularly in the roots of fair trade, but still running through very much this group, I'm sure, and elsewhere. But we're trying to bring about a more just world, as Harold was mentioning, and we're interested in looking at how supply chains can be empowering, how we can reconnect producers and consumers, and look at new types of value. And of course, therefore, advocacy and the trade justice agenda is very important. So this, you know, again, just take a step back, it's an extraordinary combination. It's powerful, market-driven model, driven to grow sales, quality products in mainstream markets. On the other hand, a very radical agenda around change. So in many ways, fair trade continues to be a social movement, seeing consumption as a political choice for people, with a small p, not party political, in and out of the market. and the kind of extraordinary work that Bruce has been doing and all the others working on fair trade towns, villages, cities, schools, universities, synagogues, has been the same thing, saying that at the grassroots level, we can build new social capital around fair trade, engage people in this wonderful, simple but clever model of fair trade towns and cities. So we have the advocacy office. We have campaigning. Right back then, quite rightly, the subject is a good deal of campaigning. And of course, we have the response to the tragedy in Bangladesh. So the roots of the campaigning side of fair trade are still strong, and I'm going to suggest at the very end, as I've said several times, but I do believe it's still absolutely central, we have to hang on to this social justice agenda and look into the future. So, again, thanks to Bruce last night, I have a habit of writing my presentations minutes before I deliver them. But in this case, quite a bit was written a few hours before I delivered it. So I saw Bruce Grammer last night and said, what should I say tomorrow, Bruce? And he said, talk about the bigger picture. So here it is, the bigger picture. Thank you, Bruce. So this is partly my day job. My day job is to think about things like fair trade in a bigger economic context. And sometimes I do think there's value in stepping back from the day-to-day work and challenges you all face. Look at how extraordinary this movement is in the bigger picture. So let's say a little bit about that first. You might have noticed there's been a crisis. The biggest global economic crisis in history. It makes the Wall Street crash look like a minor economic skirmish. And devastating across almost all countries. And of course that's one of the reasons it was such an unprecedented crisis, because of the connectedness of the global economy in a way that's never happened before. So, politicians attacking it, Eunice here, pointing out capitalism has degenerated into a casino, widespread criticism, even Richard Branson, Virgin, multi-millionaire, capitalism has lost its way. So we've got this broad agreement that there's a problem with the model. We've got a huge literature, these are just a couple of interesting examples, but you could, there's a whole library of critiques and analyses of what happened or is happening in the global crisis, how inequality got out of hand, how irresponsibility and government failure and market failure contributed to this enormous catastrophe, which of course, as economic crises always do, has hurt the poorest the most, whilst the wealthy have got away with business as usual. Just for example, returns on productivity gains in businesses have almost all gone to capital, not labour, so workers are not getting better off, even if they're more productive. So huge distortions of problems, and lots of critique of this. And on the, the more campaigning, or if you will, extreme end, we've seen people out in the streets, a democratic and a populist movement pulling apart the conventions of complacent capitalism, the famous Wheel of 99% movement, very influential in the Occupy movements across the world. This was Occupy New York. I spent a couple of days with them around Wall Street before they were unceremoniously moved on. Did anyone go and see Occupy Wall Street or Occupy New York? Some of you did. Extraordinary, I thought, extraordinary. Fantastically organised, passionate, interesting, peaceful, powerful. At the same time, of course, we've had a revolution in North Africa. We've had a huge change, and everybody knows that the work of the Arab Spring is by no means finished, and there are significant problems in Egypt and beyond. But this is just one example. Paul Mason's book, Why It's Kicking Off Everywhere, I think is a good analysis of some of the things that happened to cause an extraordinary upheaval and renaissance of a democratic spirit in countries where that was often thought impossible. So we've had this critique of capitalism, the collapse of the system, widespread critique from lots of different angles, at the same time as major political change being forced up by the grassroots. Now all of this sounds like really good, exciting opportunities for fair trade. This is the kind of context, the mood music, the scene setting, which is perfectly organised for the fair trade value to come in. And so a lot of talk has been about after capitalism. And you've written about this too in terms of what comes next. What's the new capitalism? What's the new market theory? And here are some of the things people say. We want more cooperation and mutualism, rise of co-ops, and the continuing rise of co-ops,
People talk about longer time horizons, not such short-termism, or attention to reciprocity, so looking after each other, more balanced transactions, fairer transactions, more equitable transactions, bringing in values as well as value creation. And it's a nice idea of a new economy of virtue that I've written a little bit about, and so have many of my colleagues, the idea that we don't have to abandon the notion of the market, because let's face it, all of us engage in market activity all the time. It doesn't make us bankers. Every time we buy something or exchange something, every time we lend something to a friend, that's a market activity. So markets are not evil or good. It's how people use them that's evil or good. And we don't, I think, have to abandon market activity, and fair trade is founded on that. But we can look to a more virtuous economy. And all of this, I think, again, is great for fair trade. And these are mainstream discussions. Look at this. Harvard Business Review, the airport magazine choice for the busy CEO, a rabbit on being on the plane, right? 2 years ago, Michael Porter, creating shared value in his piece, How to Fix Capitalism. My colleague at Oxford, Steve New, writing that middle piece, The Transparent Supply Chain, talking in the Harvard Business Review again about the need for honesty, transparency, fairness in supply chains. Does this sound familiar? I mean, the most offensive thing about Porter's piece is it partly pretends fair trade never happened. It's like, he calls this the big new idea in 2011. Well, you know this was a big new idea in 1945 or something, right? Maybe earlier. But, I could scoff. But the truth is, if it's here, this is a huge step forward. If CEOs of big corporations are realizing you cannot carry on abusing and exploiting, then this is an opportunity. This is changing the context, the tone. And you get interesting books like Umar Haque's book, The New Capitalist Manifesto, that talks about all the issues that would be familiar to you as fair traders: sustainability, gender equality, long-term relationships, more environmental protection. Again, but in a non-familiar context. So this is a great opportunity. The crisis is real, the crisis is hurting lots of people, but it is shaking up the pieces. They're up in the air. And now is still time to get those pieces of the jigsaw to fall down in a way that really supports, I think, and vindicates fair trade on a bigger stage. None of this is easy, so it will be a little bit distasteful to deal with people we might not like to talk to, but there is the opportunity. So what do I think fair trade can do? Now I'm going to come, those of you who are in Kathmandu probably won't recall that I came up with a very business school thing for 3 L's of fair trade, which I am going to come back to for those of you who weren't there. But I've done even better. I've now got 3 G's of fair trade here that I think we have to pay big attention to in this new context. And I think, and it looks as if we were very organised this morning, and I'd read everybody else's talks, but I didn't, I hadn't. I think these build on themes which Carol and others are pointing to. Because I think fair trade has to remember what it is that's distinctive about it, is the point of this. What is different from Nestle or Tesco or Cadbury, who have a fair trade label or engage in so-called fair trade practices, and most of you. Lots of difference, right? But we have to remember and celebrate that. So I think it's global brands, empowering governance, and gender equality would be 3 things I would point out. So let's just say a little bit about those. Well, the brand issue is problematic, right? I think there's a huge opportunity for fair trade to be a very powerful global brand. Some countries, and I'm really thinking, forgive me for being parochial, the UK particularly, have very high levels of awareness of the fair trade brand and what it means. Typically that is the flow mark, but not always, it's just a phrase sometimes too. But we have this potential fracturing of fair trade as new labels come along, or as all of you will know, the difficulty, should we say, in the United States with the transfer leaving the flow system and setting up a rival label. And we have other labels emerging. So the brand is powerful, but how we manage the brand, meaning fair trade in inverted commas, in the context of different labels, is a real challenge. And we have to try to be sensible and coherent and grown up in the way we do that. It's a challenge, but the opportunity is there. And I think it's something we can't avoid, because otherwise people will just steal the brand from us, and everything will become fair trade. Governance. Fair trade governance, I think it's fair to say, anyone who's in Kathmandu will know, fair trade governance is a lively business. Managing so many different interests in a fair and equitable way is a challenge. But whether it be flows, recognition, some would say overdue, but nevertheless agreed decision to increase the role of producers in their governance structure, or the ongoing opportunities and excitements and challenges of WFTO governance structures. There's a real distinctiveness here.
Okay. It's an opportunity to put fair trade separate from other market-driven ethical consumption opportunities. Now, gender issues may also be important here. And how do we reconcile gender equality in the governance structures of fair trade? Should be something that we are absolutely aware of. We can't really lecture other organisations or systems for not recognising gender equality if we don't do the same ourselves. But we might also mention Divine Chocolate, for example, and their engagement with Papa Cocoa farmers on the board and their ownership structure as being a wonderfully pioneering model of how governance can be distinctive in this space.
But to that final point about gender, fair trade has a wonderful story to tell. Whether it's, again, the people triangle, Tanapara swallows in Bangladesh, one of the extraordinary projects that supports the supply chain of people tree being how many people know swallows? Tanapara, hands up, do you know anyone been to swallows? Some of you will know, so I'm from it perhaps. Okay, so this is entirely focused on women. It's a holistic manufacturing but also sort of support system, so the women there have opportunity to put their children in creche, primary school, they have legal support, health support, in order to maximise their opportunity to be economically successful and empowered. Powerful story. Because of course, as we all know, the majority of the poorest of the poor are women. Again, there's Safia's campaign, the World Fair Trade Day, pointing out the connection with the women workers at Tanapara and World Fair Trade Day this year. So there's a wonderful gender empowerment story. The work that Carol and others have been doing on producing data on the relationship of fair trade and its impacts on gender equality. Powerful work, I strongly recommend this, and Carol hasn't paid me to say this. It's an advert I'm doing for Carol without Carol doing it herself, but I strongly recommend this work. It's ongoing. There's more projects that Carol's working on. So I think we have to celebrate the powerful work of fair trade in addressing gender inequality, and we have to make it a main message in the way we present fair trade as being different and distinctive and special in a market that's increasingly mainstream in terms of the basic idea of a more fair supply chain. We have to pull back and say, well, what is it that fair trade does that's so special and it's hard to imitate? We're just going to use sort of strategic thinking for a minute. What's the competitive advantage of fair trade? These are key things, I think. So, the big answers to some of those big questions are, I do think we have to, this is partly borrowing stroke stealing something that Rudy wrote, so thank you Rudy for this. It's your article. Some degree. I think we have to build a new narrative of fair trade. We have to not discard the past. We have to be proud of what fair trade has achieved. We have to look forward and say, what's the story in the next 5 to 10 or 15 years of fair trade? And I think it's about some of those issues I've already raised. I think we can look at the bigger picture, as Bruce was encouraging me to do, and say, well, how does fair trade fit within this bigger, sustainable, more just economy? How can we bring in the campaigning issues that we feel passionate about with the market and mainstreaming issues and keep fair trade special and distinctive? How can we offer a new kind of value or value system encapsulated in fair trade? Here are some of the opportunities, I think. We can point out democracy and good governance and relate the extraordinary global relationships between North and South that fair trade fosters. We can push on the sharing sustainable supply chain mainstream vision that people like Michael Porter are now putting out to show how fair trade has always done that and does it particularly well, is dedicated to it. And I think WTO, because of its complicated but wonderful governance structure of multiple networks that span the globe, has a real opportunity to think about how to position itself in this new discussion, drawing on all the upside of a complex governance structure. There are downsides, but the upsides too. So you remember this? Okay, so what do I mean about how's fair trade like the iPod? So maybe it is cool and musical and popular. Okay, just one quote from a journal, but really important. So I think what fair trade could see itself like the iPod, because the genius of the iPod was not that it was in itself that new. It's the way it brought together other pieces of innovation in one new product. So it was co-produced. So the iTunes platform, the technology in the iPod, none of that was new. Apple didn't invent any of that. Sony, other people invented that already. The iPod genius was to co-produce, to bring together all those different ideas, focused on, in this case, the customer. So this is mainstream strategy now. A key strategic task of the future organisation is reconfiguring roles and relationships in order to mobilise value creation in new forms and by new players. Well, that's fair trade. That's saying we think about the producer in a different way, we think about the customer in a different way. We bring them together in a new set of relationships that are unique to fair trade. It only works because of the ethos of fair trade, what they're all striving to do passionately. So this is mainstream strategy, but it's exactly what fair trade is doing. In that regard, there is a parallel with the iPod. Though, as my partner reminded me this morning, the iPod's now failing. Nobody's buying it anymore, so we have to remember also, you have to keep innovating. Maybe that is the next generation of fair trade, is to remember we have to keep innovating. You can't just assume that the model that's been so successful will be so successful in the future. So just the final thing is to come back to underline what I was trying to say in Kathmandu. So when I put this up in Kathmandu, looking just at the beginning of the financial crisis to what I thought was really important in allowing fair trade to carry on. I think it still applies, but maybe we now think of it as part of this co-production, isn't it? How do we bring the supplier, producer, other supply chain actors, the customer, other stakeholders together to produce this amazing thing called fair trade? And I think we have to continue to exploit, support, celebrate the loyalty of our customers, focus on their values in what we design and what we present to the market, but always remember that the legitimacy, the real distinctiveness of fair trade lies in its passionate social justice agenda, whether it be around governance or gender or building a global brand. And that's very hard for other people to copy or to steal, and that's very important. So challenging the power dynamics of international trade will always be a trump card for fair trade. Let's never forget that. Thank you very much.